There are overwhelming similarities between Australian English and New Zealand English. For example, in both these varieties, we see a shortening and fronting of vowel sounds. We also see R-lessness in both these varieties. Despite these similarities, there are also a large number of differences between these two varieties, and it is these differences which give each of these varieties a distinctive feature of its own. So we'll take a look at these differences and the differences which make each of these varieties distinct from the other one. In terms of pronunciation, we see that in Australian English, the pronunciation of the vowel sound that we see in the word bit has been raised and fronted, so much so that the word sit sounds more like seat in Australian English. Whereas in New Zealand English, the exact opposite has happened, and the difference is so extreme. Let's say that sit in New Zealand English sounds more like sut. In the New Zealand English, we also see a merging of the sounds of different diphthongs. For example, the word ear sounds more like air. The two sounds are completely merged. Let's take a look at a short informal video where a lady who is good at both New Zealand and Australian accents shares these differences between the sounds that we use in these two varieties.
And Australian. There are a lot of similarities, but there are some really key differences. And the one that I'm going to highlight for you today is a key vowel shift. It's almost the exact opposite in Australian versus Kiwi. Not quite. But so that's what we would call the short I in American, I, or a little I, versus E, an E sound. So the long E. So, for example, with the word big, in Australia, I'd say big. It's not quite big, it's not that long. It's a little bit of a shorter vowel, but it's pretty much that same shape. So I'd say big. And if I'm going to put something in my hair, it would be, or sew with it, it would be a pin. And then if I was going to beg for something, it would be beg, and I would write with a pen. So I write with a pen, and I put a pin in my hair in Australian. In Kiwi accent, New Zealand accent, so a lot of Australians pretend it's like an it's not really an I'm talking about the short I. If I was going to say pin, it's not pun and it's not pen. It's somewhere in between that. Pen. It's a very short vowel. So I almost want to write it PN. Pen. It's like P air N. So it's I put a pen in my hair and I write with a pen. And that is definitely P-E-N. I would write it that way. Pen.
So we see how pin in Australian English becomes peen and in New Zealand English becomes pen, and how these sounds are pronounced differently in these two varieties of English. Another feature of Australian English is hyperchoristics. Hyperchorism is the tendency to use a diminutive form of a name, shortening of a name. You probably can quickly relate this to the Australian commentators who use short form of the names of all the cricketers that they talk about. So Inzamam is Inzi, Imran is Immi. So this is also a feature of Australian language, Australian English, where they show a tendency to use short forms of names and also other nouns. This also gives us an idea of the informal socio-cultural setting that they have in Australia. So apart from names, there are other words which are shortened. For example, afternoon in Australian English is arvo, and a name like Barry in Australian English, as a result of hypercharism, becomes baza or sometimes even baz. So this is another feature of Australian English. The differences between Australian and New Zealand English can also be seen in terms of lexicon. So there are several lexical items which are very unique to only New Zealand English, and there are certain other lexical features, lexical items which are unique to only Australian English. Let's take a look at some New Zealand English words. Thank you in New Zealand becomes no worries. But you might have again observed yourself that no worries is gaining popularity in other varieties of English as well. The next word, pronounced batch, in New Zealand English actually means a holiday home, for example, on the beach. Again, the word egg, in New Zealand, when somebody calls you an egg, you should be offended because egg would mean a fool. So it's a form of mild insult. Then we have this word waka, which is derived from Aborigines language, which refers to any means of transport. So any means of transport in New Zealand is waka. And then we use the word Barbie in New Zealand as well. But this Barbie has nothing to do with the Barbie doll in America. The Barbie over here means shortened version of the word barbecue. Let's take a look at another short informal video where young bubbly lady shares these unique features of New Zealand vocabulary with us.
The first thing that Kiwis always say almost every day is no worries. When responding to something in conversation that goes much like this, thank you for picking me a fijoa, people would normally respond with something like, you're welcome. But not here in New Zealand. In Kiwi speak, we would respond with, no worries. The next one is somewhat of a classic. It really, really reflects the chilled out state of mind of most Kiwis. So next up is, she'll be right. So, in a conversation, when somebody says, I hope I don't burn the pavlova, the normal response would be something like, I hope not either. But in Kiwi speak, we would say, she'll be right. Next is something that I say all the time, a billion times a day, any kind of situation and any context whatsoever. Sweet as. And now to exemplify this word in a conversation. I'm going to go find us a fizzy drink. Okay. But in Kiwi speak, sweet as. The fourth thing that Kiwis always say, and I have no idea why, it's just something we do, is yeah nah. Kiwis use this phrase when they are indecisive about something. For example, do you want some LMP? A normal person would respond to this by saying, I'm not sure, actually. But in Kiwi speak, we would say, yeah, nah, I don't know, eh? The final phrase is, not even now. I heard you didn't like LMP. When responding to this, a normal person would say, no, I actually quite enjoy it. But in Kiwi speak, we would say, not even now. In summary, these words will now be put together in a conversation. I hope dinner tastes good. Yeah, nah, she'll be right, because it smells sweet as, eh, bro? Thank you for your optimism. Yeah, nah, no worries, eh? Are you being sarcastic? Not even now.
So you must have learned some new words from New Zealand English, which will help you if you plan to migrate to New Zealand or you go there for studies. So when in New Zealand somebody offers you dinner and you're not sure, you can say Yena. All right. Let's take a look at some distinguishing features in terms of discourse in Australian English. In Australia, the service provider will name the total due followed by thanks. So normally, thanks is uttered after the customer has made the payment, but in Australia, as soon as the person at the counter names the amount that you have to pay, he also immediately says thanks. So that'll be $2, thanks. In most other Englishes, thanks is only uttered after the payment has been made. So this is one distinctive feature of Australian English in terms of discourse. Discourse features of the two languages, the two varieties, in fact, have not really been studied very deeply. So this is especially of New Zealand English. So this is an area which still needs to be explored further. So we see that though there are lots of similarities between Australian and New Zealand English, there are also lots of differences which make the two varieties distinctive from each other, completely distinct from each other.